In the spring of 1945, in a village so devastated by war that even its name had been forgotten by mapmakers, something happened that should have been impossible. A British soldier, enemy of the Japanese Empire, wounded and starving, stood before a group of Japanese women and committed an act so defiant of everything war had taught both sides that it would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. What he did next violated every rule, every instinct for survival, every propaganda. Message burned into minds on both sides of the Pacific, and in that single moment, he proved that even when the world burns, humanity can refuse to die. Before we dive into this story that will challenge everything you think you know about war and compassion, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Because what happened in that forgotten village speaks to something universal in all of us, something that transcends borders, languages, and even the deepest hatreds. This isn't just another war story. This is about the moment when one man's choice to see human beings instead of enemies created a crack in the armor of institutionalized hatred so profound that it would force everyone around him to confront an unbearable question. What if everything we've been taught about our enemies is a lie? What happens when compassion becomes an act of rebellion? When sharing a piece of bread becomes more dangerous than firing a weapon? The story you're about to hear has been buried in dusty military reports and fading memories for decades. But its message has never been more urgent. Because in our world today, where we're constantly told who to hate, who to fear, who to see as less than human, we need to remember what happened in that village. We need to remember Private James Whitmore. April 1945. The war in the Pacific was grinding toward its apocalyptic conclusion. Japan's cities were being reduced to ash. Her soldiers were dying on distant islands. Her people were starving. In a small village in the mountains west of Hiroshima, a place so remote it had been spared the firebombing campaigns, a handful of women survivors were doing what humans have done since the dawn of time, trying to keep themselves and their children alive. These women, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, had become the village cooks by necessity rather than choice. The men were gone, dead or fighting or simply vanished into the chaos. These women boiled tree bark, dug for roots in the frozen ground, and tried to make soup from whatever they could scavenge. They had become experts in the alchemy of survival, transforming almost nothing into barely enough. Their hands were raw and cracked. Their bodies were skeletal. Their eyes carried that particular hollowness that comes from watching children cry from hunger and having nothing to give them. The village had been visited by Japanese military patrols in the months before. Soldiers who took what little food remained and left warnings about the demons coming from the west. British soldiers, they were told, were monsters who delighted in torture, who showed no mercy, who would desecrate everything sacred. The propaganda had done its work thoroughly. When word came that a British convoy had been spotted in the valley below, advancing along the mountain road, the terror was absolute. Most villagers fled into the forests, but the women cooks, responsibility for the elderly and youngest children binding them in place, stayed in the communal kitchen, a half-destroyed building with a single working stove and walls scarred by shrapnel. They waited, expecting the worst, preparing for horrors they could barely articulate. The sound of engines grew louder. Foreign voices shouted in a harsh, incomprehensible language. Boots crunched on gravel. The door to the kitchen opened. Private James Whitmore stood in that doorway, and he was not what anyone expected. At 23 years old, he looked simultaneously ancient and heartbreakingly young. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had once been muscular, but was now gaunt from months of brutal combat and inadequate rations. His left arm was bandaged, blood seeping through the cloth. His face was covered in dirt and exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. He carried his rifle, yes, but it was slung over his shoulder, not aimed. He stood there, swaying slightly, and the Japanese women pressed themselves against the far wall, expecting violence, expecting death, expecting everything their government had promised would come from the Western demons. The silence stretched, painful and suffocating. One of the younger women began to weep softly. An elderly grandmother pulled two small children behind her body, her weathered face set in grim acceptance of martyrdom. And then Private James Whitmore did something inexplicable. He looked at these women, really looked at them, and what he saw was not the enemy. He saw human beings who were starving. He saw mothers. He saw grandmothers. He saw himself. Because Private James Whitmore knew something about hunger that went beyond the physical gnawing in his belly. He came from the slums of Manchester, where before the war, his family had gone days without proper meals during the worst of the Depression. He had watched his younger sister die of malnutrition when he was 12, her small body giving up because there simply wasn't enough food. That memory had never left. Him had been carved into his soul with a knife. When war came, he enlisted not out of hatred for Japan, not out of bloodlust or glory-seeking, but because it meant 3 meals a day and a chance to send money home to his mother. He had killed men in combat, yes, because combat gave you no choice. But he had never stopped seeing the enemy soldiers as someone's sons, someone's fathers, human beings trapped in the same meat grinder of war that had caught him. The confrontation that was about to unfold was not between armies or even individuals, but between two fundamental forces: the machinery of war that demanded dehumanization, and the stubborn spark of empathy that refused to be extinguished. Private Whitmore reached into his pack, moving slowly, and the women flinched. Certain weapons were coming out. Instead, he pulled out his day's ration: 1 tin of meat, 1 small pack of hardtack biscuits, 1 precious bar of chocolate. It was all he had until the supply truck came through. Tomorrow, if it came at all. His unit was undermanned, scattered, operating in hostile territory with supply lines stretched to breaking. This food was his survival. His body, already weakened from a shrapnel wound that had gotten infected, needed every calorie. His hands shook from hunger even as he held out the rations toward the women. The antagonistic forces in this moment were complex, layered, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the immediate antagonism of the Japanese. Women themselves, who had been conditioned by years of propaganda to see this man as a monster. Their fear was not personal but institutional, the product of a military government that had spent years dehumanizing the enemy to maintain fighting spirit. The eldest of the cooks, a woman named Tomiko who had lost her husband and 3 sons to the war, felt her hatred rise like bile. This man represented everything that had destroyed her world. His uniform was the symbol of the power that had dropped bombs, that had killed her family, that had reduced her ancient and proud nation to starvation and rubble. When he extended the food toward her, her first instinct was to spit at him, to reject this mockery, this cruel trick that surely preceded violence. The younger women beside her trembled with the same toxic mixture of terror, rage, and bone-deep exhaustion. They wanted to scream at him to leave, to take his foreign poison and go, to stop playing games with their lives. But there was another layer of antagonism, perhaps even more powerful. The internal voices in Private Whitmore's own mind. The survival instinct that screamed at him that what he was doing was suicidal madness. He was wounded. He was starving. He was in enemy territory. These women could have sons or husbands hiding in the ruins, waiting to ambush an isolated soldier. Every military protocol, every lesson from training, every instinct honed by months of combat, told him to keep his rations, to maintain his strength, to remember that compassion in war got you killed. And beneath that, there was an even darker voice, the voice of justified revenge. Japanese soldiers had killed his friends. He had held dying men in his arms, boys from his hometown who would never see their families again, killed by an enemy that had shown them no mercy. Why should he show mercy now? Why should he starve himself for people who would celebrate his death? The silence in that ruined kitchen was deafening, thick with incomprehension and disbelief. The 2 smallest children peeked out from behind their grandmother's legs, their eyes huge in their gaunt faces. Private Whitmore took a step forward, and the women pressed harder against the wall. He could see their ribs through their thin clothing. He could see the way their hands shook, not just from fear but from malnutrition. He could see in their eyes the same hollow look his sister had gotten in the weeks before she died. And in that moment, he made a choice. That defied everything. He set the rations on the floor halfway between himself and the women. Then he did something even more shocking. He sat down, slowly, showing he was not a threat, and he opened his tin of meat. The smell filled the small space, rich and overwhelming to people who hadn't had protein in weeks. The women stared, unable to process what was happening. Surely this was a trap. Surely violence was coming. But Private Whitmore, his hands shaking from exhaustion and hunger, took his combat knife and divided the tin of meat into equal portions. 1 for him, and enough pieces for each woman in that room. He took 1 small portion for himself, smaller than theirs, and pushed the rest toward them. He did the same with the hardtack biscuits. And then, in a gesture so tender it was almost unbearable, he took the chocolate bar, that precious luxury that soldiers hoarded like gold, and he broke it into pieces for the children. Tomiko, the eldest cook, felt something crack inside her chest, something she couldn't name. This made no sense. Demons didn't share food, monsters didn't divide their rations with their enemies. Her worldview, constructed so carefully over years of war propaganda, began to tilt on its axis. She looked at this soldier, really looked at him for the first time, and saw that he was as starved as they were. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were sunken. The wound on his arm was poorly treated, probably infected, and he was clearly in pain. He was suffering just as they were suffering. The recognition was almost physically painful. She heard herself say in halting English learned long ago in school before the war made such languages forbidden, You are hungry too." It was not a question but an accusation, a confusion, a breaking point. Private Whitmore nodded, and when he spoke his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I'm starving too, ma'am. We all are." He gestured vaguely toward where his unit was probably positioned. "Haven't had a proper meal in weeks, but—" He paused, struggling for words to explain something he barely understood himself. "I lost my little sister to hunger when I was a kid. Watched her waste away because we didn't have enough. I swore I'd never— I can't watch it happen again. Not if I've got something I can share. War's already taken too much from all of us. I won't let it take this too." The confession hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. This was not a conqueror speaking. This was not a victor. This was a human being who had been broken by loss and had somehow decided that his breaking point was also his line in the sand, the place where he would say no more. "Not like this, not on my watch." The antagonism in the room began to shift, to fracture. The younger women looked at each other uncertainly. One of them, a girl barely 18 named Yuki, who had lost her entire family in the firebombing of Tokyo before fleeing to this village, felt tears streaming down her face. She had spent months nurturing her hatred, feeding it, because hatred was easier than grief. But looking at this enemy soldier dividing his pitiful rations, clearly in pain, clearly suffering, she felt her carefully constructed rage beginning to crumble. The chocolate he had laid out for the children glinted in the dim light. The children themselves, too young to understand the complexities of war and race and nationality, only understood that food was being offered. The youngest, a boy, more than 4 years old, broke free from his grandmother's grip and toddled toward the chocolate with the directness of pure innocent need. Tomiko gasped, reaching to grab the child back, certain this was the moment the trap would spring. But Private Whitmore simply smiled, a sad, exhausted smile, and nodded encouragingly at the boy. "Go ahead, mate," he said softly, even though the child couldn't understand the words. "Kids should have chocolate. Should have a lot more than chocolate, but it's all I've got." The boy picked up a piece, looked at it with wonder, and then with the beautiful selflessness of children who have been raised in scarcity, he turned and offered half of it to his grandmother. The gesture, so small and so enormous, seemed to shatter the last resistance in the room. The women, moving with the hesitation of people who have learned that hope is dangerous, approached the food. They knelt across from this British soldier, this enemy, this demon who was turning out to be just a starving young man far from home, and they accepted his rations. Tomiko took her portion, and as she held the small piece of meat in her trembling hands, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the weight of shame. Not shame for accepting food, but shame for the depth of hatred she had carried, for the ease with which she had stopped seeing the enemy as human. She looked into Private Whitmore's eyes, and she saw her own dead sons reflected there, young men who had probably died far from home, who had probably been just as scared and hungry and human as this boy sitting before her. "Why?" she asked, the word breaking on a sob. "Why you do this?" The question contained multitudes. Why show mercy? Why risk yourself? Why challenge everything we've been taught? Why complicate this war with your stubborn humanity? Private Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried the weight of every choice he'd made, every friend he'd lost, every moral compromise war had forced upon him. "Because if I don't, then what's left of me when this war ends? I've already done things I'll never forgive myself for. Killed men who were probably just as scared as me. But if I stop seeing the humanity in people, if I let war turn me into something that can look at starving children and walk away, then I'll be dead even if my body makes it home. This," he gestured at the shared food, at the circle of human beings eating together in the ruins. "This is the only thing that still makes sense to me. This is the only choice I can live with." The revelation was not dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no sudden disclosure of a hidden identity, no shocking connection between the protagonist and antagonist, but there was something more profound. The revelation of shared humanity, the uncovering of the lie that had sustained years of brutal conflict. The women and the soldier sat in that damaged kitchen, eating together, and the propaganda dissolved like ash in rain. They had been told he was a demon, but demons don't starve themselves to feed enemy civilians. They had been told he was inhuman, but the tears on his face when the children smiled were achingly, painfully human. The turning point was not a single moment, but a gradual dawn of understanding. A collective recognition that the real enemy had never been each other, but the forces that had pitted them against one another. Yuki, the young woman who had lost everything in Tokyo, found herself speaking, telling her story in broken English mixed with Japanese that Tomiko translated in pieces. She talked about her mother, her siblings, the fire that had consumed them. And Private Whitmore listened, really listened, his face reflecting every word's pain. And when she finished, he told her about his sister, about Manchester, about hunger that existed long before the war. The stories wove together, different in detail but identical in their core truth. They were all victims of forces larger than themselves, all trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. The other women began to share too, haltingly at first, then in a flood. Loss after loss, grief after grief, and Private Whitmore absorbed it all, bearing witness, offering no platitudes but his presence and his acknowledgement that their pain was real and valid and mattered. As the food was consumed, something remarkable happened. The British soldier, who had entered as a symbol of the enemy, became simply James, a young man from a place the women had never heard of, who missed his mother and was terrified he'd never see home again. The women, who had been indistinct threats in uniform propaganda, became individuals. Tomiko with her dry humor and her grandmother's wisdom. Yuki with her artistic soul and her struggle with survivor's guilt. Keiko the youngest, who still somehow managed optimism despite everything. They became people to each other, and that's simple. Recognition was more revolutionary than any battlefield victory. But the transformation was not complete, because at that moment, the door burst open again, and two British sergeants stood there, their faces twisted in fury. They had discovered Private Whitmore's absence from his post, had tracked him to this building, and what they saw before them was incomprehensible and unforgivable. "Whitmore, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" The senior sergeant, a hard-bitten man named McCready, who had seen 3 years of brutal Pacific combat, practically shouted, "You're fraternizing with the enemy. You're sharing military rations with hostiles. Get away from them now. That's an order." The antagonism had evolved, taken a new form. Now it was not the Japanese women who represented the opposing force, but the military system itself, the institutionalized dehumanization that required enemies to remain enemies, that punished compassion as weakness. Private Whitmore stood slowly, his body protesting every movement, and faced his superior officers. The women behind him tensed, expecting violence, expecting him to obey, expecting the brief moment of humanity to shatter and reveal it as the illusion they feared it always was. But James Whitmore, who had spent his entire military career being an obedient soldier, who had followed every order no matter how brutal, who had killed when told to kill and marched when told to march, had found his line. "No, sir," he said quietly. And the defiance in those 2 words was absolute. "I'm not leaving these people, and I'm not apologizing for feeding starving civilians. You can court-martial me if you want, but I won't pretend they're not human beings just because it's more convenient for the war effort." The tension in that room became almost unbearable. Sergeant McCready's face went purple with rage. "You've lost your mind, Private. These are the people who killed Thompson, who killed Davies, who've been killing our boys for 4 years. You're going to starve yourself for them? You're going to throw away your career, possibly face a firing squad, for the enemy?" The sergeant's anger was genuine, born from years of loss and trauma, from burying friends and watching boys younger than Private Whitmore die screaming. His hatred was understandable, was perhaps even justified. But Private Whitmore, swaying with exhaustion, looked his sergeant in the eye and said something that would echo through the years. "They're not the people who killed Thompson or Davies, sir. They're cooks. They're grandmothers and teenagers trying to keep children alive. And yeah, maybe their sons or husbands killed our boys, and maybe our bombs killed their families. But when does it stop? When do we get to stop seeing everyone as just enemies to hate? If feeding a starving child makes me a traitor, then I guess I'm a traitor because I can't be the kind of man who walks past hungry kids anymore, no matter whose side they're on." Chion's silence that followed was broken by Tomiko, who stood with tremendous dignity despite her skeletal frame, and spoke in careful English. "Please, no punish him. He do kindness. he share when he have so little. This boy, he show us that you also human. We think you all demons. Our government tell us terrible things, but he show us truth. He more honorable than many samurai I know. Please." Her defense of this British soldier, this enemy, was itself an act of courage, a challenge to her own conditioning. The other women rose as well, forming a protective line, their fear transformed into something else, something fierce. The second sergeant, younger and less hardened than McCready, looked confused, torn between orders and the scene before him. He cleared his throat. "Sarge, look at them. They're skin and bones. He gave them his rations. That's not fraternizing, that's just decency." The question mark at the end of his statement betrayed his uncertainty, his own struggle between what he'd been taught and what he was witnessing. Sergeant McCready looked at Private Whitmore, at the Japanese women, at the meager remains of the shared meal, and something in his rigid military bearing seemed to crack. The fury in his eyes didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps memory. "My wife," McCready said suddenly, his voice strange and distant, "is Japanese American. Was in one of those camps our government set up. I didn't think about it much during the war. Told myself it was different, that she was American, that these people over here were the real enemy. But seeing this," he trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "Whitmore, you're a damn fool. But maybe you're the only one of us who hasn't completely lost his humanity in this mess." The admission was painful, dragged from deep within, a crack in the certainty that war required. He turned to the women, attempted an awkward bow that showed he at least recognized their culture, and said in halting Japanese that shocked everyone, "I apologize for the intrusion, for a lot of things. It was inadequate, but it was something, a beginning." The resolution came not with fanfare but with quiet determination. Sergeant McCready, using his authority, declared that this kitchen was now under British protection as a civilian relief station. He sent the younger sergeant back to the convoy with orders to gather surplus rations, medical supplies, anything that could be spared. It wasn't much, the British forces were stretched dangerously thin themselves, but it was something. More importantly, he made it clear that Private Whitmore's actions, while technically violations of protocol, would not result in punishment. "Consider it a commendation for humanitarian efforts," he said gruffly, unable to quite look anyone in the eye. "God knows we need something decent to report in this whole God-forsaken mess." Over the following days, as the British unit moved through the region, something unprecedented began to happen. Word spread among the local Japanese civilians that these particular British soldiers were not the demons they'd been warned about. More villagers emerged from hiding. An elderly doctor, who had been treated at the British medical station for his own malnutrition, began helping treat British wounded, overcoming his own prejudices to practice medicine without boundaries. Children,